We're in Santa Fe, New Mexico today, speaking with Mr. William R. Lyne, who has authored a fascinating book entitled Space Aliens from the Pentagon. Good day, Mr. Lyne. How are you?
Just fine, Joyce. How are you doing?
Thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you for having me.
First of all, can you give us some general information on yourself and a brief summary of the thesis of your book?
Well, I was born in West Texas in Big Spring, 1938. My parents were from East Texas. I lived in oil towns up until World War II, and I lived south. Basically, the place I lived was southeast of Roswell, New Mexico, just inside of the Texas line, south of Jal, New Mexico. And when I was, up until I was maybe 4 or 5 years old, and my father went into the Navy, I had developed an interest in aircraft very early. I was a precocious child. I took like a watch apart and put it back together when I was 3 years old.
Really?
And but I had an intense interest in aircraft, and some of our one of our neighbors was training during the early days of World War II. Now, when Pearl Harbor happened, well, my father volunteered for the Navy and went into boot training, and he was going to go into the Seabees, but they talked him into going to the regular Navy because he had a wife and children. So he went to California, and then eventually our family went to the Oakland Bay area, Oakland and San Francisco, where my father was in charge of the printing plant for the Navy at San Francisco Naval Depot. So I spent a couple of years in California, and I kind of nurtured this interest in aircraft and other things, ships and all sorts of things. And I saw a lot of stuff during that time because I would go to the naval base with my father and see a lot of these things. I got on a ship, and they put me behind the guns, and I was able to, experience what it was like. And my uncles were all in the Navy, and after the war, we went back. At the end of the war, towards the end of the war, my father shipped us back to the Gulf Coast, where we stayed with my grandfather down in east of Houston. And I now know that the reason he shipped us out of there to get us out of the Bay Area was because of the nuclear tests that they were getting ready to perform in that area. And it has now come out about that, people have come out with information on that nuclear test, and that was obviously the reason that he got us out of there, was so we wouldn't be near that blast, because they didn't know how big it was going to be. And then after the war was over, then we moved back to West Texas, to Kermit, Texas, which is on the near the New Mexico border, as I said. And soon after we moved back to that area, I was building a lot of model airplanes of the very complicated stick variety. We had a lot of intricate parts and stuff, and gluing them together and so forth. And I was flying and testing these things, and then building experimental models. And I had heard.
How old were you at that time?
I was about, I was 8 years old at that time. And there were oil field pumpers who traveled all the way up into the Roswell, Artesia, all up in that area to service pumps up there, because it was a very desolate area at that time. And they would tell about these flying discs they were seeing up there. And everybody in West Texas knew about the influx of the German technology. Von Braun had been brought to Fort Bliss in 1945 and was hired by the U.S. as the chief of U.S. Army Ordnance immediately. He was signed up under Operation Paperclip. And the whole thing in Roswell was more or less known about by the people there. Roswell, the real big area was Alamogordo. That was a more interesting bunch of development, because actually Alamogordo is where the flying saucer experimentation project was brought, when the Germans were brought over here under Operation Paperclip. But anyway, I grew up interested in this stuff. I built model airplanes, belonged to model airplane clubs, and when I was 14, I even invented the ground effects system that's now used in all the Indy racers. And I gave that technology to a friend of mine in 1967. It was immediately put on the Indianapolis Racers by Jim Hall, who had his shop in Midland, Texas. I didn't get any credit. I mean, Hall knew where it came from, but I didn't get a cent for that technology. But I developed that when I was 14 years old, the ground effect system for cars, and actually tested it with model cars. I was intensely interested in seeing flying saucers. And starting in about 1947, first of all, let's go back a little bit. My father, you couldn't get building materials at the end of the war, and because there was a shortage of building materials, and veterans could get materials for housing. They had the first priority. But my father bought the POW camp at Roswell that was used for the prisoners of North African troops of Rommel.
He bought?
Yeah, he bought the whole POW camp up there from a man named Rice in Roswell. So we went up to Roswell to get this stuff, and we were up in the area in 46 and 47. And
what was his interest in buying it?
well, to get buildings. He got these buildings. These buildings were made out of #1 kiln-dried pine for the paneling.
Okay.
I mean, it was totally no knots in this pine, and it had fir timber and a lot of good materials in them. So we bought this whole camp, brought it down to Kermit. We used one building just for wood, which we used for cabinetry, and we had a cabinet business. But anyway, that was just an interesting side thing that later ended up feeding into my flying saucer scenario when I discovered they tested the neutron bomb, because I later worked with the commandant of that camp when I worked for Union Oil Company of California. And the ex-commandant was Dave Dunn, who was a geologist for Union Oil Company of California, or an engineer, I can't remember. He did the U.S. Geological Survey for John F. Kennedy. He was in charge of that. So, but he had some postcards that were taken by Rommel's troops on the Libyan desert showing the neutron bomb explosions that they tested up there. And they were used as morale builders for the troops. They were superimposed this explosion over New York City to show what they were intended to do. And so the troops were carrying these cards. They were kind of crudely printed by field lithographers, but they were photographs, basically. A photograph of New York City on the bottom, a photograph of the neutron bomb explosion on the top. And I later determined that was neutron bombs that they were testing. Anyway, this interest in flying saucers was kindled because they were seeing so many in West Texas anyway.
And did you see one as a child, or?
Well, the first ones that I started sleeping in the backyard about 1947, early 47. I started sleeping in the backyard, and I could see at night squadrons of flying saucers in formation coming over from New Mexico, maneuvering. And they always turned in increments of 30 degrees, 60 degrees, 90 degrees, always a multiple of 30 degrees or 30 degrees. And so
and as a child seeing those?
Yeah, and I'd see them at night. I could see them as lights at night. They were just glowing objects at night in formation at pretty high altitude.
And did you think they were aliens
No,
in space?
no, I knew they were coming from New Mexico.
You did,
Yeah.
even as a child?
Yeah, and my mother had picked up the rumor that they were powered by a nuclear device, they were under the AEC because they used helium in a nuclear reactor, which didn't make any sense to me at the time, but I now have information of how that worked. It wasn't really any radioactive active materials involved. It was a nuclear energy process that was used on the saucers to power them. And that is, something that I put in my book on how that technology works. But see, helium will produce 460,000 calories per gram atom of energy, which is roughly about 4 times as much as atomic hydrogen, which is 710 times as much as normal hydrogen. This is something that I've come up with recently about how much this energy is produced by these gases. And we're told that helium is an inert gas, which is a big cover-up of an energy secret.
Well, if these...
So now let me get back to the first saucers now. So I I was at a scout ranch in 1950, on June 1st, 1950, in Kermit, back in Kermit, 120 miles to my east from where I was at the time. A flying saucer appeared on the first day of the Korean War over this water tower. And it hovered and then went back to New Mexico. For about 15 minutes it was there, and the whole town watched this. My mother saw it, and all the people that were in it. She was teaching a class, and all of her students, plus the city hall and the firemen and the mayor and everybody else saw it. And my friend Ken Burroughs, his father had a drugstore, took a photograph of it. The Air Force came in, bought all of his negatives and photographs, and paid him $250 and confiscated everything. And those pictures have never been published. And if you compare what was really a saucer really looked like in a real photograph, you will see that they don't look like anything like the ones you usually see in the books. They've got a lot of fabrications to conceal the way they really looked. The next day there were two of them up there. So there was, so here was all the people in my family in my town seeing all these things. And I was over in the Davis Mountains, so I didn't see them. I had seen them in a distance at Roswell when I was caddying for my father at a golf tournament in 1946, at a distance, just a glinting disc in the sun. But I never saw one up close, and so it was until 1953 that I finally saw one. We were having an ice cream party in the backyard, and I was turning the ice cream freezer crank. My sister was sitting on the freezer, and I looked up, and there was this saucer hovering. It was gyrating like this, basically precessing wildly. And I screamed, "What's that?" And everyone looked at it except this woman, tenant of ours, who was Mrs. Humphreys. And Mrs. Humphreys was in charge of U.S. Army aircraft gunnery at Sarasota, Florida in World War II. She was the chief of Army aircraft gunnery. It was kind of amazing that a woman held that position during World War II. And she was an expert on aircraft.
How did she get that job?
She had the rank of captain. Probably a good shot originally. Probably raised, I think she was raised on a ranch and was a really good shot. But she was probably a flyer also, and as a lot of people were in the ranch country in those days. And she didn't look at it much. She just glanced at me. She just looked at me and cocked her eye like this. As I looked back and forth between the saucer and her, she just cocked her eye like that and just went like that, as if to say. I decided later that she was probably a security agent that was stationed there. She worked as a substitute teacher. Her husband was a tool pusher, but she could have been a security agent, which they would put them in surrounding towns all around those bases where they were doing that experimentation. And because I'd been building toy flying saucers and experimenting with electromagnetic stuff, and she kind of looked at that with a kind of cool candor, like this kid's going to figure it out, And but anyway, I saw my first saucer, and its precession decreased and increased in frequency to a high frequency shimmy as it speeded up, did two turns, and then disappeared into infinity in 3 seconds. So I knew that it accelerated extremely fast, which I later think is about 9,000 miles per hour, roughly. Could have been as much as 18,000, but I think it's more like 9,000. And it put off an electrical corona, so I knew that its means of propulsion was by electrical discharges. That the electrical discharges were also somehow, as you see, as it is accelerated, it left a I call it buttermilk trail of corona that corresponded to the frequency that the pulses were being emitted. As the thing took off, it left this silver trail of ions that had little lines in it, little interruptions in it that corresponded to the electrical pulses.
And what year was that?
1953.
And how old were you at that time?
15.
15. So that really was what piqued your interest then, I guess.
Well, I'd been
No
that
doubt.
for aircraft. I practically memorized Jane's handbooks of aircraft of the world and so forth, and I've been interested in this technology ever since I had found out about the flying discs in '46. When the hoax came along in 1947 at Roswell, I just laughed at that. I knew that it was a hoax. And later on, I had heard that it was rhesus monkeys in G suits because my brother-in-law's aunt was the nurse at Roswell who became a nun. She was a survivor of the Bataan Death March, and had grown up in Mescalero, New Mexico, and Mescalero, which is where Goddard had his laboratory. Mm-hmm. And so they knew about Goddard, and they knew about Von Braun being there before the war, because Goddard experimented in the 30s. He had a workshop in Mescalero in a firing range, or a test range at Eden Valley, where they tested his early rockets. And Von Braun, I found out, I didn't find this out until in the 70s, that I found out that about Von Braun coming over before the war. But I had heard about the rhesus monkeys, and in 1970, or 71, I believe it was. Let's see, I believe it might have been 71 or 70 or 71. A newspaper reporter in Odessa gave me a couple of photographs that were originally sent out with the original Roswell hoax, and they showed rhesus monkeys in G suits. And one of the photos showed the corny little mock-up flying saucer they'd made, which was like a caricature of a flying saucer. Mm-hmm. It wasn't big enough to even hold the 4 monkeys unless they were just crowded in there, packed in there like sardines. And there wouldn't have been room for more than one of them in the cockpit. And it was like, had a little bubble on the top with an old auto antenna that they put on the top. They add that little touch, It was like off an old Ford or a Chevy or something. It had a ball on the tip of it. It was kind of bent a little bit, Mm-hmm. And it was a very corny representation of a flying saucer, and that's probably the reason the Pentagon hit the ceiling, is I don't think they cleared that hoax through the Pentagon. The intelligence spooks probably at Alamogordo concocted this, probably former Nazi flying saucer scientists probably concocted this hoax. But all of this had a strange flavor to it that I equate with the Egyptian religion, because the SS had an intense interest in the ancient Egyptian religion and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, we want to get into that a little more too. But going back to when you were 15, or all throughout your life, I guess you were interested in UFOs, and then you went on to university and
yes,
got a
I was in Air
bachelor's
Force
degree.
Intelligence, and just by, it was kind of an inadvertent fluke. I stumbled across a KGB cell when I was in basic training, and these guys had tampered with the test scores, my test scores, and so I went to the adjutant and reported that. And then when I was in Keesler in training, they had actually misclassified me. They'd reversed my scores so that it looked like I was real bright in administrative material, ability, aptitude, and so they put me in a ground control and approach school. I wanted to go to jet mechanics school. I wanted a background in jet mechanics, hands-on aircraft experience, and they put me in ground control and approach, and so I.
Why do you think were you already researching some of these flying saucer machines at that time? Or?
At Keesler Air Force Base, Arthur C. Clarke, head of the British Interplanetary Society, came to give us a talk on unidentified aerial phenomena. And so I went to this lecture, and it was at the base theater in Keesler in late 1956. And I went to the lecture, and Clarke concluded that he showed, had slides and so forth, and he showed pictures of weird clouds and weather phenomena and stuff, and he concluded that all this stuff was just natural phenomena, mirages and so forth and so on, that flying saucers didn't exist. So I went up and I shook his hand and I said, Dr. Clarke, I very much enjoyed your lecture. It was very interesting, but you and I both know you're a goddamn liar and that flying saucers are man-made electrical machines. And he just smiled and shook my hand, and a couple of days later, my roommate's brother showed up. It was right before Thanksgiving, 1956. He showed up and spent 4 days with us. He was, his name was Thomas Hayward, Thomas W. Hayward. Eddie Hayward was his little brother, and he was my friend. And it turned out that Thomas at the time was a Navy commander, also closely connected to the Office of Naval Intelligence. And he showed up and he said, I know about the trouble you're in. I've come to try to help you get out of this trouble. I think it's being created a lot by the KGB. I was in a lot of trouble. I was being washed out of this school because I was falling asleep uncontrollably and had been given I didn't know at the time that this belladonna that the doctor had given me was uncut solution. It was like 100% syrup. It was supposed to have been cut 10 times. It was for a stomach upset that was probably induced by somebody putting something in some coffee. And so basically they were messing me up, this belladonna, and I didn't know why I was falling asleep, and I now have a problem with it. I've had a permanent problem ever since. The belladonna I was getting was almost enough to kill me. And anyway, he was there to help me get out, and I was being visited. I was going to bars at night and stuff, trying, typical thing you do when you're young and don't know any better. Just putting up with all those problems I was in. And I was being visited by DIA and CIA and Air Force intelligence people who would come up and tell me they were going to try to help me out. And they said that Eisenhower had classified the whole incident because what had happened is they'd found the KGB cell. They had discovered these guys were a KGB cell, that they were running the career counseling center and sabotaging the records. And that another guy that was in my outfit was also a mole. They had classified him into counterintelligence to get one of the people into the, inside our intelligence apparatus. And so they caught these guys, and they thought that the KGB was inside the Air Force, was retaliating against me, is what Tom thought. However, I think it was just the Air Force trying to cover up its dirty linen. They didn't want anybody to know about this incident because these guys were operating right under all the so-called experts' noses, and they just transferred them to the Army. They didn't prosecute them. There wasn't any public outcry or anything. And then subsequently, right after that, they caught Colonel Rudolph Abel a few miles away on the Texas border, trying to make his escape through Mexico.
And who is?
So these guys evidently were turned on Abel, who was in New York City. He was the head of the Western Hemisphere operations for the KGB. So they caught him because of catching these guys that I tipped them off about. So that was like 6 agents that I was responsible for them catching. That's probably more than any. That was 18 years old. That's probably more agents than any CIA person's ever caught in one swoop. But anyway, it was kind of humorous because these guys were obvious to me as a kid, But anyway, I was washed out of the school even though I had the highest grade in the last phase I was in. I had the highest grade. But they said I had insufficient grades, just had to have some phony reason to get me out of there. Then they shipped me up to Ohio, of course, and put me in this intelligence unit. It turned out that this intelligence unit was the same unit that in World War II took the original photographs of the Foo Fighters over Germany in the B-17s.
And the Foo Fighters are flying saucers?
Yeah, they were flying saucers, small one-man or two-man flying saucers. They were sort of shaped like a turtle. And they didn't operate the same way as the saucers that the saucer I saw in '53 operated. It was perfectly round and symmetrical. But the Foo Fighters were oblong, and I actually saw the films that they took of the Foo Fighters. And you could see there was a little window up in the front where these guys were flying these things around. They were kind of like little buses flying around, And they had a little different way of controlling these ships. I think they relied on a simpler system. They were like little hot rods, flying saucer hot rods. They were the very bare essentials, and they were probably very dangerous, and they were reputedly they were flown by young boys, like teenage members of the Hitler Youth or something like that. But I had heard from my friend when I was a child in '46, when the Pampas started reporting these things, that these were flying saucers, that these were Tesla technology, from my friend who'd grown up in the Cimarron territory. And my friend there, he was my good friend's father. His whole family would know about anything. I mean, anything that happened in the Southwest, they would know about it. They had like a network, an old network that went back into the Old West.
How do you explain if flying saucers are man-made machines? How do you explain the accounts of people seeing extraterrestrials? They swear that they've seen these little aliens
Let me
from
explain.
outer space?
Let me explain how the CIA does it. They go out and hire them 100 people. Those people then talk about thousands of people seeing things. There is no thousands of people. There's 100 people that are on the payroll. Their job is to keep referring to these thousands of people who don't really exist. There's no documentation to back it up. How could they know about these thousands without the documentation? Unless there's been a thorough scientific study of all these people that are supposed to have seen all these things or experienced all these things, it's a lie.
Mm-hmm.
They just put these guys on the payroll and they repeat it over and over, make the lie big, repeat it often, and it will eventually, it's just like a paint job. You put a coat of paint on every day, pretty soon it's that thick. And that's the technique they use. There are no people seeing aliens. There are people seeing pictures of aliens in magazines. There may be some people seeing aliens in conjunction with hypnotic suggestions and this sort of thing. I think that Dr. Mack in Harvard uses narcoleptics because I have a knowledge of narcolepsy. I know what's possible.
Can you explain that?
Well,
Define that.
narcoleptics have cataplectic hallucinations. Cataplectic hallucinations are an intensely realistic dream that is created by your own mind, and they're extremely realistic. They're a demonstration of the power of the mind to store information, because these dreams are just as realistic as me and you sitting here, and you can change them and alter them. You can order up anything you want. Your mind will produce this stuff, and it is just incredible. What the mind is capable of storing, you realize that. And so what he's doing is he's probably advertising for people with sleep disorders, and then he's sorting through and finding the right people, the ones who are willing to believe in aliens. Then all he has to do is make a suggestion and show them some pictures, and they will see these aliens. The mind
Or
will
like
produce these
brainwashing.
aliens. Yeah, oh yeah. It's made to order. But the thing is he's protected by the privacy between a physician and his patient, so that you cannot subpoena those people and find out all the particulars. And the only ones you can find out are the ones who are willing to go public with him. And then they're on the payroll, basically. They get paid for this research. And
What about the Roswell incident when supposedly they discovered bodies of aliens?
those were rhesus monkeys. They had a rocket sled over in Alamogordo. This is the reason I know that this was concocted at Alamogordo, which is where all the Nazi saucer scientists were located. Alamogordo is a special base, whereas they tested nuclear weapons over at White Sands. The people at Alamogordo were more into the saucer research. Although they've claimed that there was certain rocket research going over there. The rocket material has always been a cover for the flying saucer material. But the rhesus monkeys were used on the rocket sled for testing for acceleration, which was intended to build up to the moon shots, because von Braun was really calling the shots on all this stuff. And initially, they have the Southwest Primate Center in Alamogordo, which is a primate center where they have all these monkeys, different types of monkeys that they use for different experiments, medical experiments, and so forth. And initially they were using rhesus monkeys, but these monkeys were so violent from the loud noises and so forth that they deafened them. They cut their fingertips off with clippers, and that's the reason you get that report about the suction cup tips on the fingers, is because when you nip them off with a clipper, it just leaves a little suction cup. It heals around in a little suction cup like shape.
Why did they cut them off?
Because they have very nasty claws. If they claw you, you get a horrible infection. I got clawed by one of them at a circus when I was a child here on the hand, and it got horribly infected. And they're very violent, they're very strong, and they have really long teeth, so they pulled their teeth out. And they had to shave these monkeys to put them in the G-suits, because the G-suit works on pressure. It has all these pressure lines that go all over it in lacings. And those pressure lines swell up and tighten the suit to force the blood up to the brain to keep the palate from blacking out.
Oh, really?
And So
How do you
they had to
explain
shave the
big-
monkeys.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So they looked like aliens when you shaved them. And purportedly, for the hoax, they just dyed them green. They rubbed green pigment. And they came to our store in West Texas to get the pigment. That's what was interesting. They came to our art supply business to the south, which is where everybody came for any kind of artistic materials or anything. They bought them. They had to come down there. We were the only ones selling that material in that whole area.
Well, if they had
And-
these uniforms on, why did they have to dye their skin? I guess,
Just to make them look like aliens.
yeah.
They had
What
uniforms
about
on
the big
because they
black
were.
eyes that they say, the Greys have these long
that's
black
just-
eyes and big
That's just an exaggeration
helmets?
from the rhesus monkeys have these large almond-shaped eyes, you see. So that's just
They could be
kind of
wearing
like-
glasses or
Well, they
something.
didn't have those initially. That's
Oh,
just
I
something
see.
they fabricated.
Something they have
That's a
now.
lie. You know,
Yeah.
that's just a bunch of lies. They just exaggerated it to the point that it's getting ridiculous. But of course, the Pentagon people knew that someone was going to identify those as rhesus monkeys when they used this in the hoax, and that's the reason they hit the ceiling and went out and retrieved all the photos, except for those two that the newsman gave me. Now, another thing that recently came up that I mentioned in the book is a man who lives in Santa Fe got a copy of a photograph that was taken of when they did the original hoax. They took one of these monkeys and dissected it. Now, they didn't do an autopsy. I mean, you wouldn't do an autopsy of an alien being. You would do a dissection. And so they went through this whole rigmarole, and you know, the nurse is sitting there saying, "Oh, these are rhesus monkeys. I've seen these before because they eat them in the you know, in the Malay Peninsula where I was on the death march, you know, and they eat these with green peppers. It was the main diet over there." And she knew that was a rhesus monkey, and they went through the whole rigmarole of dissecting, and they pinned the facial musculature, for instance, out on a board. And this guy showed me this photograph, and I knew right away that that was a rhesus monkey facial musculature. You could see where they'd cut out around the ears and the eyes and everything and laid this facial musculature out on a board and then took a photograph. Well, he got this photograph, and he was working supposedly with Time Life to you know, to do an expose, or it was supposed to. He thought, well, maybe this is an alien autopsy, you know, because that's what it was. This is where it came from. It came from Roswell, and because his father worked in that area, and he got this photograph through, you know, under the table connections, and he was working with Time Life to do a video disc and all this kind of stuff, and they were making offers, and on one day that he was negotiating this thing, I was at Toys R Us, which is across the way from where his business was, and there was a CIA guy pulled up there in a Hummer. It had CIA license plate. It was an Army Brown Hummer, Central Intelligence Agency for official use only on the door. And he walked across over there to this guy's business. And so I later talked to the guy, and he said that he'd sold the stuff. You know, he'd sold the rights to it. You know, and I later found out that he had sold the rights to supposedly sightings. But actually what he did was he sold it to the CIA. And so sightings has never shown us anything on this so-called alien autopsy, which was actually a dissection, which is more scientifically viable of what they would do. If they actually had an alien life form, they would call in the best scientists in the country. They wouldn't be running around in concealed masks and all this kind of junk in a primitive government building. They would have the very best equipment, the very best scientists, and they would be taking, you know, big time scientific note of what was going on. And they wouldn't be scooping stuff out like they were digging stuff out of a, you know, a meat market or something. They would be very carefully dissecting all of these things as they went along.
So I guess we can assume that alien autopsy tape
Oh,
is definitely a hoax.
it was
then.
corny. It was. I could do a better one myself. It was.
They had Hollywood people analyzing it and saying, whoever did this, we'll hire them and so forth.
Well, they said
Saying
whoever
it's an
did this,
excellent job.
whoever did this hoax could definitely work for us, you know. And you know, that was, you know, that's practically what they said. That's basically what they said. But That's a little bit of a stretch because they could do a better one than that. It wasn't very well done.
Well, do you believe that there's life on other planets? And if there is, couldn't they reach us in similar flying machines that we supposedly have
Well,
today?
ever since Einstein wrote his theory of relativity, it was a cover-up for the real physics called ether physics, or what I call it. I call it occult ether physics because it's concealed from us. And when Einstein found out about Tesla's discoveries, then he was, on behalf of the Illuminati, he created relativism, which is a cover-up for the real physics. It's basically, it's used as a misinformational physics to cover up the real stuff, ether physics. However, you know, when they talk about a unified field, you have to have something to unify that field. Without an ether, you can't unify the field. You have to have something in space to unify the field. And so the whole idea of a unified field theory was totally useless without a unifying matter, which is, i.e., the ether, which fills all space. It goes through, it permeates all the atoms in our body, and when we move, it basically creates a resistance with our atoms, and all the atoms have to line up and the electrons spin along, and this is what causes momentum, is they screw us forward in space, because once these things get going in a pattern, they tend to perpetuate that motion. But the whole thing is that they created the whole thing in relativism of time travel. And it's a fallacy, it's a hoax, so that they could get around the fact that aliens couldn't get here because it's too far away to the nearest habitable planet. If they saw us from 1,000,000 light years away, the light that they would see when they looked at us in a telescope would be 1,000,000 years old already. So what they're seeing is 1,000,000 years old. And if they could travel at the speed of light, it would take another 1,000,000 years for them to get here. That would be 2,000,000 years from what they saw. And it's just
and so there's no such
incomprehensible.
thing as maybe some kind of rip in time that they could
No,
come
that's
through
phony.
and come quickly, or just
All these things
instantaneously?
started out in philosophy classes as hypothetical arguments, and now they propagate these things as if they were scientifically valid, and they're totally fallacious. There's no possibility of anybody traveling in time because time doesn't exist. It's like you'd have to have something to travel in, some sort of space or dimension or something. It doesn't exist. There's only one dimension, that's reality. We have the right now, forever. I mean, it's always right now. It'll never be tomorrow, it'll never be yesterday, it's always right now. What is happening in the universe right now will never happen in that same context again. You can't take anything out of that context. If you could travel back in time to you would have to travel back to where the Earth was 100 years ago, for instance. The Earth wouldn't be there. You would end up in dangling in space.
Everything's constantly changing.
And the Earth is over here. It can't be over there when it's over here. It can't be in two places at the same time. So they'll try to ask you to believe in a dual universe and all kinds of phony, fallacious arguments that are strictly for the suckers. You know, they figure if you believe in anything mystical, that you're a sucker for another mystical belief. So if you believe in God, or you believe in angels, or you believe in fairies, or tooth fairies, or Batman, or something, then you're made to order. It's easy to key into that and get you to believe in these alien things, or whatever else they want you to believe. But the main key is there's only one object here, and that's to conceal the technology. There's two things, actually. There are two things that can work here. The big lie technique, which was developed by the Rockefellers, and the SS was trained in this, was the big lie technique. And that was to stretch the credulity of the public so that they will accept the big lie, which is basically anything you want to tell them. And that was the mass psychology system that was tested in Germany under Hitler's regime. Basically, they started whispering campaigns about meeting with aliens in the Andes and all sorts of stuff to cover up the flying saucer stuff that they were doing in Germany, which they, you know, but anyway, I'll get to this.
Okay. I wanted to just mention that there are other writers who claim that we never went to the moon and that the Apollo landings were in fact a hoax. Do you have an opinion on this?
Yeah, I've seen the photographs that come from NASA that show the astronauts training in a gravity-free environment. And those same photographs were used on the moonwalk. Exact same photographs, except they're just mirror images. Flipped it over. They flipped the image over. But these exactly same images. They were used in the gravity-free environment, which they say was an airplane that was flying up, but it was more like probably a flying saucer or something they were doing this stuff in. So basically the whole thing is a hoax. They want to make us think that they're doing more with rockets than they're actually doing, because you can't walk in outer space because of the radiation. You'd have to have 2 meters of shielding, according to my friend Renee, who's written a book called NASA Mooned America. And 2 meters of shielding to protect you from that radiation.
So what are they doing with all the money that's going into?
Could be putting it into the flying saucer stuff. The rocket stuff developed after the flying saucer was actually a reality. Tesla actually tested these things as early as 1893. He tested the principle when he worked out the ether theories and supposedly published his dynamic theory of gravity in 1897, but nobody has a copy of it. They scavenged the country and took every single bit that they could find of Tesla's material that related to that. And in 1915, he tested the flying saucer with a beam, carrying the energy to propel the saucer. It was remote control, but it wasn't radio control. Anyone who says that a flying saucer could radio control is full of it, because you can't radio control these things. The electrical field around them blocks out the radio impulses. Mm-hmm. So you basically can shoot a beam at them and control them that way. Mm-hmm. With Tesla's, basically his power beam, mm-hmm. which is pretty simple actually. It's not very complicated. And but then he tested them in 1940. He announced that he tested all 4 of these special things that he developed was what means of producing a high voltage, high potential, a means of propulsion, which has been disinformation in the HARP patent to read, instead of propulsion, repulsion. It was a means of propulsion. The original New York Times article had the word propulsion, not repulsion, not as it's been misstated in this so-called patent. Mm-hmm. So basically he announced that he tested this,
So the technology that's being used today for these so-called flying saucers is actually Tesla technology?
Yes. And I tried to reconstruct how the Germans got a hold of that in 1936, because before World War II, contrary to what a lot of people have believed, Goddard was shooting rockets in 1935. He shot one of his rockets at something like 7,500 feet, which was further than any German rocket had gone. And so the Germans' government ordnance department, which had just begun to set up this center at Peenemünde, was very interested in Goddard's work. And so they sent, the first person they sent over there was William Lyne, who was a brilliant German scientist, young German scientist who had introduced von Braun to rocketry, actually. Ley had studied with Obert, who was the German rocket pioneer, and actually was Hungarian. Anyway, Ley came over and to work with Goddard, and but he defected and he married a Russian ballerina. And so Hitler sent young von Braun, who was probably about 20 or 21. He got his PhD and was appointed as the director of research at Peenemünde, of rocket research, and awarded his PhD with the title of Herr Dr. Professor of Research. And he was also boosted in rank in the SS to the rank of Obersturmbannführer, which is basically sort of like the position of a protector from invasion. And of course the weapons they were building, V2, were Vergeltungswaffen, which is a type of revenge weapon. So anyway, von Braun was invited over under the same conditions that Ley was invited over by the American Rocket Society, which was basically the Smithsonian Institution and the Simon and Florence Guggenheim Foundation and National Geographic and the Smithsonian Institution. So anyway, young von Braun, Hitler wanted to make sure he didn't defect, so he boosted him in rank and made him one of the top scientists in Germany. So he couldn't turn down a deal like that. So they wanted to make sure he came back home with this technology. And he came over and he worked with Goddard between 36 and 38 in New Mexico. And he would work with Goddard down south, and then he would come up to Santa Fe, supposedly to have a good time and take out some women in Santa Fe and have a good time at the La Fonda and whatever. But he was actually running this secret project called P2, small p, large 2, at Los Alamos, at the so-called, near the so-called Boys Ranch up there, which was most likely an American Jugendbund camp, similar to Camp Valhalla in upstate New York. However, they've covered all this stuff up. I mean, it's very embarrassing today because before the war there were a lot more people involved in this type of activity because they didn't think there was going to be a war. And as a matter of fact, the United States was an ally with Germany until the 1939 invasion of Poland. And so von Braun was given all this material by Goddard while he was running this flying saucer project. And I've tried to piece together how they got hold of the Tesla technology. I think it probably came through the Sperry Gyroscope Company because Tesla had tested a inertial guidance system with Elmer Sperry in 1917. And so the Paltokter compass, the polar slave compass that I show in the book, which is one of the half of the inertial guidance system that was built by the Germans in 1943, was probably a Tesla invention for which there was no patent because it was highly classified.
And can you explain exactly what that is, Mr. Lyne?
Well, this is called a Paltokter compass. That means a polar slave compass. Kind of humorously, in German, Tochter is equivalent to a slave. And so, the label here shows that Paltokter compass, and then the name of the project, KT dash small p large 2. Okay, the P2 is basically a dipole, which is a Tesla coil, oscillating electromagnetic dipole. And here you have the grid number 127-178A-1. So that gives you an idea of that's like a production number. This is in a batch between 127 and 178 to give you an idea how many flying saucers they had built with this particular device on it on this date, which is 10/1/43, October the 1st, 43, which is the work number. And so at that date they had between 127 and 178 flying saucers that these things were being made for. This is half of inertial guidance system. This is the slave compass. There was a master compass, which would be called something like a Meisterkreisel compass, which would be a master gyro compass, and that gyro compass would be calibrated to give them a true north reading, so that no matter which way the flying saucer turned, the gyro compass would be an inertial system that would give a true reading for north, and then it would turn this little motor on, rotate this little dial around to give the correct heading. And this little thing here is a dial with a little lightning bolt symbol on it there, which is a symbol for the negative currents. And this has got calibrations 30 degrees right, 30 degrees left. Now, when I was a child, I noticed the flying saucers turning in 30-degree increments. That's the round saucers, not the flying turtle types, which can turn in curves. These saucers turned in coordinated 30-degree, 60-degree, multiples of 30-degree angles. And this device, when I saw it, I recognized it for what it was because it had everything in 30-degree angles, 12 different directions, you see. Right. And so this device would be would be operated in conjunction with these. There's 14 contacts here.
Those are contact points, and they're pretty modern looking.
Yeah, they are. For 1943, they had a cable that clipped on here and then snapped in here, just like, this is where we got this type of electrical design. And 2 of these contacts run this 6-volt motor, and the other 12 contacts correspond to each one of these directions, so that when the saucer was turned, then the motor would be turned on until the dial rotated to give the correct heading. If I was going true north, okay, and I turned 30 degrees to the right, then the motor would come on, and this dial would rotate around 30 degrees to give the correct heading that I was on. And then there would be a system of switches which would activate the correct electrode to give the right polarity to the ship as it moves sideways. And this is, of course, to be mounted this way, not this way, since north wouldn't be up and south wouldn't be down. So it would only make sense this way. And how many aircraft can turn in 360 degrees? So that tells you that it's a round ship, and the fact that it's a Pile-Toker compass was made necessary by the Faraday effect of the field around the saucer.
Right.
So that they had to invent this for the flying saucer. Tesla developed this in conjunction with the Sperry Gyroscope Company in 1917, and that's where Werner von Braun and the Illuminati, the Prussian Illuminati, got hold of the idea, was through the Sperry Company, and they did their first tests at Los Alamos in 1936 to 38 to make sure the technology worked before they took it back to Germany and developed it there at Peenemünde. Here you have the ground here. This says ground here, so
Right.
that was just meant that this was grounded to the framework of the flying saucer, and so this is the slave compass. The master compass was a gyro compass, and this would give them the heading, because at 9,000 miles an hour you can lose your bearing very fast. You can overshoot your destination and so forth, and so this was a crude device compared to what they have today.
Now, how did you come across this, Mr. Lyne?
I bought this from a salvage dealer in Albuquerque. The salvage dealer got it from a guy who was in charge of bringing salvage around to sell off of the bases in Albuquerque, Sandia base. When the spooks found out that I had this, which they evidently found out about pretty fast because I was showing it to a number of people, they went to the salvage dealer and wanted to know how he got it, and he said, well, this guy brings stuff out here from Sandia base. They put the same guy under surveillance, caught him stealing classified salvage and selling it. And that's what this was. This was classified salvage. They told the guy that it was classified salvage. Then they told him that the guy was caught doing it again and put to jail. So they basically violated their security regulations when they confirmed that, because they're not supposed to confirm things like that. But what they basically did was confirm that this, yes, is part of a German World War II flying saucer that was brought to Sandia base from Germany under Operation Paperclip.
Wow.
And that shows that also that the Sandia was one of the bases where some of this technology was brought. This came off of a project that was Kreiselteller P2, and that doesn't correspond to any of the information that has been released through German sources, which in my opinion is nothing more than CIA, NASA disinformation released through German sources to make it look valid, with a whole lot of phony references to mystical groups and things like that, like the Frill Society and the Thule Society. But actually, you got a bunch of aeronautical scientists and stuff, involved here, and they don't give a crap about the mysticism.
Well, I think they like to mystify things up
Yeah.
to keep a lot of people away from looking at it.
So the top of of this indicator dial here shows a lightning bolt on it.
Okay,
See?
let me try and get a close up of this. Can you just move your finger?
Yeah. And then the south, this is an S down here. I don't think that stands for south. That wouldn't make any sense. That sounds for something else.
Okay.
Because this is a lightning bolt symbol here. As far as I understand, they should be able to turn this thing and then push a stepping switch and get a change in direction, because these things turn at high speed in a sharp angle. Doing, doing, like that.
Right.
See? And the ones I watched when I was a child in the night sky did that. And I knew that, so I had already drawn dozens of these things for navigating on 12 directions, you see, when I was playing around with flying saucer designs. I had already designed these. I knew that there was an electric field around them, and a compass would not work, so there had to be some way to. Of course, at that point, I didn't think in terms of inertial guidance system. I was just thinking in terms of how to control these things, how to change the polarity and so forth. And the 30-degree breakdown is not a bad idea. And when you're hovering, gyrating crazily, you can't even see what's going on outside unless you have some special way to do this. So what they did is they created an internal gyroscopically stabilized cockpit that was ball-shaped, that was mounted on gimbals, so that they could climb inside this when they were hovering and be able to look out through a double layer and see what was outside while the ship is gyrating. They could look out in a stable position and see what was going on, look out the bottom, look out the top. And then when they began to move at high speed, they could get out of this internal cockpit to another cockpit outside that. And because at high speed, it's just a mere shimmy. But at hovering, these things were called teller, which is gyrating plate or gyrating saucer, because they gyrated wildly when they were hovering.
And a lot of people who claim to have seen UFOs say that they're just, sometimes they just
Yeah, they get
sit
the
there.
wobbling, but they don't realize it's a gyroscopic action, or what in German is called Kreisel.
I see.
And Teller, of course, is the German word for plate, like you eat on type of plate. And they later came up with the popular name of the words for Tasse, Untertasse, fliegende Untertasse, or something like this, for, it looked like a saucer. So that would be a more popularized name. And in the disinformation that was released in Germany, they naturally, to cover this up, they knew that there were people who could make the connection between this technology and Germany. Nobody had ever made a connection to Tesla before I came along, and that, it was obviously if they had, they were stamped out. That was one connection they didn't want anybody to make because it was pretty obvious. Tesla experimentation was suppressed when I was a boy, especially after World War II. They were prosecuting people for operating Tesla coils, and they were using the FCC regulations, to say they were causing radio disturbances and this sort of thing. And they were, basically suppressing spark gap generators and this sort of thing because they said it was interfering with communications and all this kind of stuff. But it was really just a cover-up of the Tesla experimentation. They didn't want people to do it. And my friend who has the radio guy, who'd grown up, admiring Tesla as a boy, because Tesla had done his experimentation in his area when he was a boy. And I don't know whether he ever met Tesla or not. He may have, because he lived right in the same neighborhood. And but he became, he was so interested in Tesla's stuff that he was a real expert on it. And he knew about the connection to the saucers because Tesla had tested flying saucers in Colorado. People knew about it, and but that's where the original term flying saucer was originally used, was in Colorado and before the war. But this is very well hidden nowadays. It was put over as a hoax to ridicule the idea. When people came out with this information in Colorado, they were ridiculed as hucksters to cover up the fact that Tesla had done this research.
Knowledge of underground bases, and would this be where the government's hiding all of these man-made flying machines?
Well, if you'll notice, they created all of these ICBM bases all over the country. Then all of a sudden they closed them all up. Well, there are all these underground tunnels and bases, and they're all interconnected. It was all a copy of what the Germans did during the war. During the war, they tunneled Germany. They had underground bases all over the country. They ran tunnels from one end of the country to the other. And after the war, well, then they adopted that program in this country. And they tunneled America. And these missile bases are all done in sections, so that one contractor maybe builds the silo and maybe so many 100 yards of tunneling. And then he's taken off that job and taken to another location in the country to build the same thing there. Another contractor is brought in. He builds another section of the tunnel, but he doesn't know about this section, so that each contractor only knows about a certain amount of this tunneling. But all of these tunnels all add up to a tunnel system that goes all over the country. So they've got the whole country tunneled, and the missile silos are kind of like outlets. And the opening in a Atlas missile silo is big enough to get a flying saucer in. So that was just a cover. The rocket stuff's always been a cover for the flying saucer stuff. They close the missile base down, and they've still got a saucer base and a tunnel system that's big enough for convoys of trucks to drive through. And so there are tunnels. There are tunnels between Monsanto Base and Albuquerque and Sandia Base and Los Alamos, for example. And some of those tunnels run across. They'll disguise a tunneling operation sometimes as a mining operation. And they'll be bringing all this earth out of the ground, but they're really doing a tunnel under there. And yes, they do have these tunnels. And it all started at the end of the war because everything that we did was kind of a copycat thing of what the Germans were doing during the war. It always happens in history that when somebody conquers somebody, they copy them. It's like the Romans conquered the Greeks, and then they copied them. And so forth. It seems to be a pattern in history. So we beat the Germans in the war, supposedly, and we copied them. So we have a Nazi state system in this country. In the government, and the National Security Agency is illegal and unconstitutional, but it was built around the Nazi intelligence network inside of the Gestapo known as Reichssicherheit Hauptamt 6, which transliterates into National Security Agency Division 6. And that was the division that was headed by Reinhard Gelling, who went into the Soviet Union in the German invasion and gathered all this information in Russia, which later became the files of the libraries and all of the intelligence divisions. Basically the file photos that were taken in Russia. And the National Security Agency was built around the German agency. It wasn't created anew. It was formed around the original people that were brought over here under Operation Paperclip. So all of these Nazi intelligence experts on the Soviet Union hyped this country into getting into the Cold War. And I maintained that this could be seen as a form of revenge for having won the war, as getting us into a Cold War with Russia. But the arms manufacturers have loved it. You know, they've really cashed in on all this stuff. And but according to what experts who analyzed the situation say, the Russians didn't plan on attacking the United States, but they had us convinced they were going to attack us any moment. But they were more or less prostrate after having fought the war. They were glad that it was over, and they had no intention of invading America. But there's a whole sequence of events that happened at the end of World War II that have been totally lied about and covered up. There was an end to World War II that's totally different from what the public thinks it was. And there was a stalemate, which I'd heard many times before I pieced this all together, that there was a stalemate in the war. Now, a stalemate is like a checkmate, you know, where both sides are stymied. What kind of bargaining power did Germany have? What was going on? And how did Germany manage to carry out a stalemate against the United States? If they were totally collapsing, the Russians were invading, what was their bargaining power? I put together this information from tidbits here, tidbits there, and other pieces of valid information from reliable sources that the German Navy was carrying on a mission. And of course this is mentioned a couple of times by braggers in Nazi Germany when Goebbels said, "Our secret weapon is about to explode in America's face." And this was at the time that the bunker was collapsing, and you know, the Russians were surrounding the bunker area. And when Dönitz formed the government, was given full authority to form the new government, Albert Speer as he walked out of the meeting, he was heard to exclaim, "We now have an operatic government."
An operatic?
Operatic government. An opera. What is an opera? An opera is a big show that somebody puts on. Now, what that means is the bunker was the opera, and the fat lady was Hitler, you know, and the opera ain't over till the fat lady sings. Now, what was happening is the bunker the fall of the bunker was just an attraction to draw in the Russians and the interest of everybody and everything. This is the collapse. But meanwhile, the German Navy is carrying out a secret mission to deliver the secret weapons, which was the neutron bombs. And what they had was they had 24 of these electro U-boats, which they surrounded the United States main targets with. And they were carrying ICBMs, which could be fired from underwater and would deliver the neutron bombs to New York City and other major cities. And it has been recently pointed out that Werner Heisenberg, who was prosecuted at the Nuremberg trials, evidence was entered against him in which he was heard to say, Himmler asked him how big a bomb it would take to blow up New York City, and he said, the size of a pineapple, and I'll have a basketball for the Fuhrer by Christmas.
Wow.
So that was the neutron bomb. Obviously, an atom bomb, Fat Boy, and all this other stuff is much bigger than a pineapple or a basketball. And it has now been documented that this delivery system, the rocket delivery system, was a small type of auxiliary submarine that was being towed by the other boats that could be put into position that contained the rockets, that contained the, of course, nuclear warheads. And part of the conditions of, you see, Germany could not use these on us without sacrificing everything because the Russians were invading. They wanted to stop the Russians. They wanted to save at least half the country. And at this point, if they had used the weapons on us, it would be all over for Germany. They could have bombed us, but there wouldn't be anything to go home to. So they had to work out a deal. And of course, the United States didn't want to get bombed. They didn't want to turn it into a massive suicide. So they worked out a deal where all the technology was transferred. All these things were specified. All the German war technology would be transferred to the United States. All the personnel would be protected from prosecution. All of those guys that had potential war crimes. You notice in the Nuremberg trials, nobody who had high technical information was prosecuted for war crimes. The only people who were prosecuted were the political guys. And the guys who were generals and so forth that didn't really have any technical knowledge. All of the technical people were protected under Operation Paperclip, and the OSI, Office of Special Investigation, which was set up under the Justice Department to supposedly ferret out Nazi war criminals, actually was to protect potential investigators from finding out about all these guys in Operation Paperclip who had done heinous crimes against humanity in the researches and so forth. And so they were actually protecting some of these guys, like the guy that worked over at Sandia Base, who was the one that took people and dunked them in freezing water and stuff to see how much cold it would take to kill them. And he was used by the Air Force. They used all his data and research, and himself included at Sandia Base and Kirtland. And so basically all these people were recruited under Operation Paperclip, and all the documentation and papers all came into the hands of the CIA at that time. Part of the provisions of the stalemate was that all of the skippers had to open the hatches and go down with the ships with all men on board on those submarines that carried the neutron bombs. And that's what happened. And then Howard Hughes Glomar Explorer was later used to pick these things up off the ocean floor so that some unfriendly or uncontrollable group might not get a hold of them somehow. Because they still had classified technology aboard. And I maintain that those neutron bombs were red mercury technology, and that's where the Russians got it. And it's subsequently been documented that there were nuclear transfers between the Russians and Germans in South America. Since my book has come out, people have come up with documentation to back that up. So what they actually did in the last days of the Third Reich is they put all this technology aboard U-boats. So that it was basically traveling around in the ocean. And some of it was buried, like General Otto Skorzeny buried a big stash of secret documents in the riverbed in Czechoslovakia. And these things could then be turned over to either side, so they had bartering power with that technology, like don't find me guilty, or I will tell the Russians. I have a guy waiting around that's going to tell the Russians right where that stuff is buried. If you prosecute me or send me to prison, that will go to the Russians. So they had all this stuff to guarantee that they weren't going to go to jail, and that's the reason Operation Paperclip was recruiting all these guys. And it was part of the deal that they struck in the stalemate, in the secret deal. And I call it the phony fall of the Third Reich. Anyway, this material that it was turned over, okay, anything that anybody says is evidence of German UFOs has come from the CIA, you see, and the ONI and the National Security Agency, because they got all that material. Anything that anybody says they found came out of them, because they're the ones that, they got all this material. Anything that anybody says they have had to go through their hands, so you can't trust it. It has to be something wrong with it. It's false information. I find some validity in some of the materials I've seen, like some of the drawings seem to be valid, but you can't trust the labeling. You can't trust the names of these projects. You can only trust what you see and what you're able to interpret from what you see. And even some of that could be tampered with, because they're not going to release valid information, especially if it's highly classified. So anything that they've released is misinformation, including the names of these flying saucers, which probably did not have those names, and then these intelligence spooks are sitting around and laughing at these guys running around talking about these things that never existed. Like they overplayed the idea of the esoteric, mystical side of it, you know, like the real society and all this stuff, and naming the ships after this stuff. And I don't believe there's any validity to that. I don't believe German scientists were going to do that, and aeronautics engineers were going to fall for that kind of crap. And it wasn't based on any kind of mystical stuff like Schauberger. Schauberger was kind of a charlatan. His stuff never flew. All those pictures are nothing but models. I mean, they're just air conditioning vents is about all they amount to, fans and blowers and stuff. They got these pictures of these models that Schauberger made out of copper, and they were putting these things out like they were really flying saucers, but actually they're just 3-foot diameter models. And you know, if you blew all the air you wanted to through there, you couldn't get that thing off the ground, and you couldn't stabilize it. You've got all kinds of aerodynamic forces at work there. First of all, you're going to burn the vents. They're going to get sizzled with the amount of air you would have to pump to make those things go up through those vents. And you know, you've got air turbulence and all sorts of things to deal with. You've got vortexes that develop, and to make that thing stay in a stable way, it would require a lot more technology than what they've shown. And that's also disinformational. I think that some of the photographs and some of the drawings actually are the possible drawings of some of the electropropulsive craft based on Tesla technology, but they've totally misrepresented the technology, and they've tried to say that it was boundary layer technology and all this kind of stuff. And all of the research in that area went into nothing except maybe to perfect aerodynamic aircraft. But what I saw in 1953 was not aerodynamic. I wanted to be an aeronautical designer and an aeronautical engineer when I was a boy. But when I saw that flying saucer, that was the end of those plans. Because I decided aerodynamics was obsolete. This craft did not obey aerodynamics. It did 90-degree turns and disappeared in 3 seconds. By all rights, it would have burned to a crisp with the friction. It didn't make a noise. So there was a principle at work here that involved electropropulsion that also lubricated this thing as it went through the air, so that it didn't create a sonic boom, it didn't create the friction that you normally have. If you have electrical discharges, you're creating attractions and ionizations ahead of the craft. And this basically what happens is the gas is actually split apart by repulsive forces created by the charges as the craft moves through, and then they don't come back together very fast because of the ions. They're basically repulsive, so that stops the stuff from clamping back together, and it also prevents a lot of turbulence in the back of the ship. And So basically, it's kind of a self-creating system that automatically does away with the problems that you might have.
Before we leave the subject of Operation, what was it, Operation Paperclip, what do you think happened to Hitler? Supposedly he committed suicide, or?
Hitler had at least 4 alphas. Those are lookalikes.
Really?
Some of the speeches that were supposedly given by Hitler in their own film were actually some of his his doubles. They were trained to speak and look and walk and everything like
They
like
have
Hitler.
surgery or something?
See, one of the alphas was found outside the bunker, and that's the first one the Russians claimed was Hitler. But it wasn't him. It had attached the body, the man that was in the body, that had that body, had attached earlobes, and Hitler had detached earlobes.
Oh, really?
And so that was, right off, I knew that was phony. The burned corpse of the man and the wife was Goebbels and his wife. And that was obvious from the profile, because Goebbels is all sizzled and he's laying back and he's got that beak, that nose of his. It looked like an old pharaoh mummy or something. It was obviously Goebbels. He was all skinny and so forth. And that was found in the courtyard of the bunker. That was Goebbels and his wife. They have no other bodies. So what happened to Goebbels' body and his wife's body? So this was Hitler. This, according to the misinformation, the Russians now admit, ever since the downfall of the old Russian regime, that they didn't get Hitler's body, that they got a bunch of fake things and duplicates and so forth. And Hitler and Eva Braun escaped. The whole thing was all set up just to buy time for the stalemate. So the whole thing was a big opera in Berlin. It was supposed to look like it was supposed to look like what you call it, a Götterdämmer room, from one of Wagner's operas, where everybody goes down in flames and dies. And so that was the idea behind it.
I guess the whole world would want Hitler dead, right? So
Yeah.
they had to-
But the guy had bargaining power, with all these weapons and stuff, and no one knew about it because that's all been shushed up. Now, the United States government pays Israel something like $30 million a day or something like that.
Something outrageous amount.
And that, I think, is hush money, because inevitably the Israelis and the Mossad are going to find out about this deal, and so they're going to blackmail the United States government unless they pay them all this money as reparations or something. So this is basically what the government is paying Israel for is for using these Nazi scientists that they wanted to prosecute, And they knew, and they were protected by the Israeli government and by the American government from prosecution. That's the reason the only people they ever prosecute are people like guards and stuff. They have never prosecuted anybody that I know of that had any real scientific knowledge. And it's a known fact that, for instance, Mengele actually worked at Sandia Base. Dr. Mengele was actually used at Sandia Base.
Really?
Yes, in Albuquerque. And they subsequently prosecuted Eichmann, and he didn't have any technical knowledge, strictly a political situation, big show trial. But the whole thing of Operation Pace, they had 3 OSIs. Isn't that confusing? 3. There was one OSI, Office of Special Investigation, under the Justice Department. There was another OSI, which was Office of Special Investigation for the Air Force, which only checked out UFO sightings around Air Force bases and had no authority, supposedly, off the Air Force base. Then there was the third OSI, which is Office of Scientific Intelligence, which is a branch of the covert operations under the CIA Office of the Scientific Directive of the CIA, and that is obviously to gather intelligence relative to scientific stuff and to disseminate misinformation regarding special, highly advanced technological things. And so basically under these organizations, such as the OSI of the CIA, they would, and as well as NASA, they would just disseminate misinformation. They have think tanks that don't do anything but dream up the scripts for movies. They write scripts for movies, and they have authors who pose as the authors of these things, but they didn't write them. They're actually written by teams of PhDs who were employed by the Office of Scientific Intelligence.
Well, are you saying that the CIA may be behind a lot of the movie
definitely.
industry?
Yeah, sure, they have been from the very beginning. They've
Is
been
that
behind it.
right?
And that's the reason that people like Philip Glass works for the CIA, and he's also a special, property of the Smithsonian Institution, which, connects to the Smithsonian Institution, see, to the CIA and misinformation. So he's basically a denier, a total denier of flying saucers. They don't exist, which is an idiot's idea. I mean, the idea that flying saucers don't exist, he's got to be crazy. There are thousands of airline pilots, thousands of reputable witnesses have seen these things. I've seen them. I know they exist. They're right over our backyard. Am I going to deny something that's right there, and hard facts and hardware right there? And I saw one over Hyde Park in January the 26th at 7 o'clock in the evening. I was sitting in a hot tub in Hyde Park, and one appeared. All the people in the hot tub got a look at it because I was looking right at it when it started to fly, and it was around 200 feet wide, 400 feet long, had a soft dark green color on the bottom, and you could see the Tesla corona come around the outside, the purple Tesla corona. But it was stealthized. It was intended to fade into the sky. So it was all these things were suppressed, like the corona, the purple corona was about the same shade, light value as the sky, and the dark green was suppressed to make it fade into the sky, but I was able to see it because the moon was almost behind it. It came through and lit up the corona more than it was supposed to show up, you see. So the light was coming through the corona.
And you mentioned earlier that on these flying machines, they have maybe just a few lights grouped together in one spot to make it appear that it's smaller, and to make you have like an optical illusion. You can't see the whole outline of it.
Yeah, they have little bunch of lights that flash and make it look like a small airplane. But when that thing lights up to fly, it's like you get these people making comments like it just came out of a doorway in the sky, Well, that's just nothing more than special effects. It's like magic tricks. It's like that phony UFO they put over the Olympic thing out in California. It was just a big frame that was suspended from a helicopter. And they had lights on it, and nobody could see the helicopter up here. It was really high, and they had this whole thing suspended from high altitude, so they saw all these lights, and it looked like a continuous body, but it was just a framework with a bunch of lights on it. And of course, basically they use these flashing lights to confuse your eyes. If the lights weren't flashing, even when these ships are moving very slowly, you'd see that they glow faintly. Despite their stealth technology, there's still a little bit of corona leakage, and you can still see them very faintly glowing, usually a green color. And so they put these flashers on there, and the eye can never see through that corona, or never see that faint corona. And when they move faster, it lights up brighter. But that's the reason when they're flying around at night, usually over cities and in view of people, they're moving very slowly with these flashing lights that look like beacons, is to cover up that corona. The eye can't recover in time for the next flash. And that's what I was talking about with these people in the hot tub when the thing actually quit flashing, turned dark green and lit up, and was at arm's length. It was about 3/4 to an inch long and about 3/4 of an inch wide at 10,000 feet. And it flew in a circle that was 30 degrees. From here to here, it was 30 degrees in 10 seconds. I said, look at that. And I followed it with my finger as it came around, and then it's skidded to a halt right where it started. And it was lozenge shaped, like a big lozenge. It looked like a football field with a track around it, green here, and here's a track, and then the corona was outside of there was a dark space, slight dark space, and then the purple corona was coming out here, which indicated that the corona was coming off the top and then shooting out this way. In other words, that was the suspension system to keep it up, and then they manipulated the discharges to make it move around in a circle. They just basically activate one corner, and then the wind keeps turning the thing as it moves. It was like a Foo Fighter on a giant scale.
Can you give me a brief explanation in layman's terms of the science behind flying saucers?
Well, basically, it's the Tesla coil is the main motive principle behind the flying saucer. The Tesla coil will spit out negative charges on one end when it's tuned properly. And when the current you're talking about a high frequency, high voltage, alternating current air core transformer. The reason air core is because it's at high frequencies and high, voltages. If you had an iron core in there, it would heat up and cause problems. So you have an air core, and you're not limited like that. And also an air core transformer will oscillate at its own natural frequency, whereas an iron core would maybe slow down the reaction and kind of limit its output. Now Tesla used a lot of 1/4 wavelength. At 1/4 wavelength, you have a peak output on one end of the coil and negative charges coming to one end of the coil and peak negative, and peak positive at the other end of the coil. So you would have a positive corona on the bottom of the ship and a peak negative discharge on the top. Now, positive corona looks soft and foggy and cloudy. Negative corona is hairy. And so that's the reason these saucers are often seen when they're hovering. You can see the hairy lines of discharges coming out of the top. You've probably seen the picture of that Soviet saucer that was hovering, and they showed the hairy lines coming out of the top. Then there's a photon effect at the bottom. You have photon energy released by gases in the air that are being excited with a very short atomic half-life. It's basically a synthetic radioactivity. The gases in the air are transmuted temporarily into radioactive isotopes of very short half-life. And when those isotopes return to the ground state, they emit photons, which is a type of positive discharge. So you get this bright, sometimes bright white. So they put a coating on the bottom of the ship to suppress that so that it turns dark green or something like this to limit that photon. Now, if they tune the coil to 3/8 wavelength, then you get a neutral on the bottom. You don't get much of a discharge at all. And you get a peak negative on the other end. And at high frequency, the negative charges continue to flow out the coil even when the current is reversed, because the electrons gain inertia and mass as they're accelerated. So they'll actually continue to flow out because there's a time lag, and it kind of the air kind of rectifies it and creates a pseudo-electrostatic type of discharge. So you can shoot out negative charges with this alternating current, and it just spits out negative charges on one end. You can polarize that any way you want to. Now, the way the flying saucer works is there is this ether, and it's stationary in space, and it's dense. It's denser than we are. But because of its ultra fineness, small, 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 in relation, we are crude. Our atoms are way spread out. The atoms and the electrons, there's huge spaces in between. This ether is in those spaces, okay? Now, if you use an MHD principle, magnetohydrodynamic principle, you can propel yourself through this ether. By spitting out those negative charges, you basically are pumping yourself through that ether, and it's moving through the body. The same way that
Is that how they supposedly beam people up from the ground or whatever?
They can beam people up by using that whole principle, because by comparison to the ether, we're very etheric. It should be the other way around. We're the ether. The ether is this solid material that's in space, and it has a lot of mass. It has a lot of density. And at high voltage and high frequency, you can grab hold of that stuff. Just like if you had a million ropes, tiny ropes moving that were going through your body that you couldn't feel much, you get the high voltage up there, you can grab hold of these ropes and pull yourself up. And by polarizing it, you can make those ropes in any direction you want them to be. You're pulling yourself, pumping, just like a squid pumps itself through the water. Basically, a flying saucer pumps itself through the ether. And it doesn't disturb your body, because this stuff's already there anyway. And so it's not creating any special uh, atomic effect in your body. And besides, as Faraday said, a solid vessel, a metallic vessel, will force all the negative charges to the outside. If you put a negative charge inside, it appears mysteriously on the surface. So you don't have to worry about those negative charges and X-rays and stuff inside the ship. You have to have those electrons to create the X-rays, and the electrons are forced to the outside by the one of Faraday's effects. And Tesla based this on Faraday's electric solid ether theory. Faraday had the idea that the ether was an electric solid ether. That means it's an electric solid. It's a different type of solid state than we think of as normal matter, of being solid state. And so Tesla tested this in the 1890s. He set up 2 plates and he electrified them with his coil. And at a quarter wavelength, he said that at high voltage and high frequency, at sufficiently high voltage and high frequency, the space became solid state. So basically that was a test of Faraday's principle, and then he went on to invent electropropulsion based on this.
Yeah. And you have a lot of diagrams in your book, Space Aliens from the Pentagon,
Yes.
in here, and a lot of stuff on Tesla technology and so forth. I wanted to ask you briefly about the cattle mutilations, and you said that these people who supposedly said that they were abducted or whatever, they're imagining this or whatever, but could it be that maybe the government is actually abducting people and experimenting or whatever?
There's an
Just
outside
a thought that came
possibility.
to my mind, but
There's an
how
outside
can you
possibility.
explain the cattle mutilations?
Well, the cattle mutilations are, what they're doing is they're testing particle beam weapons on these cattle.
Okay.
Now, one of Tesla's death rays is nothing more than a solid hunk of aluminum.
Uh-huh.
And with high voltage DC current put on one side of it, and then it's enveloped in a vacuum tube, and some of the air pumped out. And when you put that high voltage current on there, this bulb, a solid hunk of aluminum, puts out a beam. I'm not sure what kind of beam it is, except Tesla said it was a positive beam, which means like X-ray and so forth. Now, supposedly, by changing the voltage, you can change the frequency. So by upping the voltage, you can create any kind of X-ray, gamma, cosmic, whatever kind of radiation you want with this simple bulb. And his death ray was nothing more than this bulb surrounded by, outside it, with an electrode. So the bulb would create an ion beam, and then when you put a high voltage electrical discharge here, it would be carried back outside the beam, go to the target. So you could just electrify something at a distance, or you could shoot power over there. This is one of his transmission systems for shooting DC current through the air or whatever. But this bulb, basically, now what was the question?
Wanted to ask, well, people have claimed that they've been abducted.
Oh, right,
had
I'm going back to the
experiments
cattle
on them.
mutilations.
And
Okay.
also I was tying that in with the cattle mutilation. Why would the government be mutilating these cattle?
Well, they're not really mutilating them, they're removing tissue.
Okay.
All right, they're removing, all the tissue they're removing is the tissue that you would remove if you were testing ionizing radiation on biological species. Cattle are close enough to humans to be used as surrogate humans to test this stuff out for killing humans or making them sick or anything else they want to do with them at a distance and not being detected. Obviously, the reason it's secret is they don't tend to use this in regular warfare. They want to go around and be able to go around in a flying saucer and shoot you with this beam while you're in your house, give you cancer, give you AIDS, give you hantavirus, give you mycoplasmic pneumonia. If your T cells are all dead, you're going to die of pneumonia. Just the same as an AIDS patient, a hantavirus patient, a pneumonia patient. It'll give you tuberculosis. It can give you cancer. All of those things can result from being shot with this beam. And this little stupid little bulb can do the trick.
Really?
The first X-ray that's known to be taken was taken by Nikola Tesla from at least 100 feet away in his workshop. He took a photograph of a man with the film behind him from at least 100 feet away with this little bulb, which means it puts out a beam. And then he sent the photograph to Röntgen, and a year later Röntgen claimed the discovery of X-ray using the more complex Lenard type tubes. But Tesla's bulb is much simpler and very easy to make. Now, if they can tune this, in other words, if they want to have a stealth murder weapon, meaning a weapon that nobody's going to know you were murdered, you're going to die of what somebody's going to call, what some damn doctor's going to call natural causes, then they would want to test this on cattle continuously until they could learn to tune these things to get just the right effect. They want to make you have pneumonia, they want to make you have this, they want to make
Why
you have
do they
cancer.
want to do all this to us?
So they can murder anybody they want to and not be detected. That's the obvious reason why it's all secret. And that's the reason they don't do it in a laboratory. They use cattle, because cattle are mammals just like us. And so they remove all the tissue. Now, there was a scientist in Albuquerque that pointed out that he found a standard blood coagulant in those carcasses, and indication that microwave was used in the process of removal of the blood, because all the copper was missing from the liver. In order to get the copper out of the liver that way, you have to use microwaves. It's like using in certain types of advanced autopsies. If they want to get everything out of your system to analyze, what they do is they shoot you with a blood coagulant. This makes all the blood cells stick together a little bit, and then they put you in a microwave chamber and withdraw the blood, and it pulls it out of everything. All the blood out of out of all these small blood vessels all comes out, and then they run that through a counter to see what kind of ions and what kind of cells are present. How many T cells? Are they good T cells? How many, dead cells and so forth? And they want to find out what kind of damage they're doing specifically with these weapons. And then they remove the tongue, the genitalia, one of the ears, eyes. All these things are useful in studying for ionized radiation damage. And they want something that's clean. They want a cattle, a livestock that's out there in a clean environment, out of the cities and so forth. And
Well, I was going to ask, why don't they just buy a bunch of cattle
it'd be
instead
too
of killing?
expensive, and it would attract attention if they had this big bunch of cattle that they were experimenting with. So they can just chalk it up to the sucker out
Plus,
there.
they also want us to believe in UFOs, aliens from outer space.
I believe this
To
stuff is so
perpetuate
highly
the-
connected and so heinous that they don't even want the military people to know about it. It's like very few military people know about the flying saucers. It's very high level. It's way above top secret, and they basically are developing a system where they can call the shots. They can go out and get rid of anybody they want to. They can make you sick. They can slow you down, or they can kill you.
And why are they
You can't
covering
stop
up this flying saucer technology? Why are they keeping it from the public?
Because of the energy. The electromagnetic interaction is 10 to the 40th times 2 stronger than the gravitational interaction. That's 10 with 40 zeros strong. That means that a tiny amount of electrical energy can pick up a huge mass and carry it anywhere very cheaply, because of the big lies they told in science. You ask them about a force, you ask them about energy. They've got all these confusing definitions in physics now because of relativism. But all energy, or all work is force over time. In other words, if you exert a force over a period of time, you can do work. If you increase a greater force, if you increase that force and exert it over that same period of time, you will do that much more work. So if you take a normal force of gravity, convert it into electromagnetic force, and exert it for the same period of time as the gravitational energy would be exerted, you will do theoretically 10 to the 40th time power greater work, times 2 greater work than you would with the gravitational force, which I show in the book with a simple mathematical situation to show how much work would be done by 1,000 foot-pounds of energy.
So it's all about really covering up the fact
Or
that
1
we
foot.
have free energy, that
Yeah.
we don't really need to pay for
Yeah.
all of this. And
Well, it's just a big
corporations or...
relativism. If you study it, they basically have distorted the law of conservation of energy. The law of conservation of energy states that you can neither create nor destroy energy, you can only change its form. Well, I maintain that energy per se does not exist. There is only force. There are natural forces in nature and in physics, and if you exert this force over a period of time, you can do work with it. what the law of conservation of energy says is that all motion is perpetual. That all energy is perpetual. You can't create it or destroy it. You can only change it in form. So therefore, there is all this perpetual motion, and it has potential to do work. All you have to do is channel it. And one of the reasons why they tried to destroy the belief in an ether was because the ether is where you can really get hold of this energy. And all you have to do is take normal atomic matter, especially the light elements, which are easy to deal with and work with, because it takes low energy excitation energy to make this stuff react. The electrons are put into higher orbits, and they basically take in a larger volume of ether. When they relax and go back down to the ground state again, they shoot that energy out. They create radiation and so forth that's of much greater magnitude than the amount of energy it took to make this atom expand. Some atoms are very unstable and they're easy to excite. Some can be excited with nothing more than a magnetic field or a little bit of heat or a little bit of daylight. And so these atoms, these electrons jump out and then they go back down and they shoot the radiation out. It's very high energy. It can produce a lot of heat. It can produce electrical charges and so forth. And this is a source of unlimited energy.
So that's why we never heard about Tesla in high school and university.
Well, they confiscated. In 1943, when Tesla died, there were only 3 people present. There were 2 FBI agents and a German nurse. I maintain the nurse was an SS nurse who was trained in interrogation. She used drugs, and they wanted to find out where all Tesla's materials were stored, all his inventions and all his files. And I maintain that they tortured the old guy to death and learned the location of his files, which ended up in the confiscation of 80 trunks of his materials, 80 large storage trunks that were stored in 3 or 4 different areas. And they took that under the Alien Properties Act, even though Tesla was an American citizen. And some people think that this was turned over to the people in Tesla in Yugoslavia. No, they released 170 pounds of material, which was strictly historical stuff that wasn't sensitive in any way, to Tesla's relatives in Yugoslavia. And that is the stuff that's on display in the Tesla Museum. But none of it involved the sensitive material. Most of it is material that doesn't go anywhere beyond about 1920 at the latest. And it doesn't involve any of his big discoveries that are so important in the way of energy. So we don't know much about what Tesla did. We can only speculate. But I mean, there have been a few leaks here and there of what he was really working on and what he really did. But 80 trunks is a lot of material.
Earlier you were mentioning Israel and the billions of dollars of reparation money that's being sent to Israel all the time. And you mentioned in your book Ernst Zundel, the German-Canadian revisionist. And I was just wondering what or maybe you could explain briefly what the connection is between your book and Ernst Zundel.
Well, I think Zundel was persecuted in Canada because of his saucer material. That was the way I found out about him, was an ad about German flying saucers, which it turned out I never got the book because it was out of print or something. I never got the book about...
Books that he's written himself?
That books, some of which he's put them out with Samestag Publishers, has put them out, and some of them are written by other people. I don't know who wrote the one about Hitler's flying saucers. It could have been that guy Friedrich. But I point out that this material about German flying saucers is based on this information as far as the technology is concerned, because these are documents that went through the CIA's hands. I mean, they got it all. There's a group in California called German Research Society, or the German Research group out there, and they have a lot of material that they've gathered, but they're starting to realize that a lot of it is misinformation. I mean, if it was released by the British or American or the German government, then it has to be invalid to to a large degree. There may be some valid material into there that you could sort through and find, but it wouldn't be in the terms of the labeling or what it says, because they would alter all of that stuff. They wouldn't be allowed by, under security regulations, they wouldn't be able to release something that was sensitive. So what you get is what they want you to have, misinformation. I'm convinced that, I know that Germany had these aerodynamic flying saucers, and they were strictly misinformational because they date after the P-2 project at Los Alamos. So I know that they had the electropropulsive technology, and I've seen it on the film of the Foo Fighters, which I saw when I was in the 8th Air Force Intelligence. So I know that this other material based on boundary layer technology is invalid and it's misinformational. So the German government apparently ran these whole projects just for disinformational purposes. I mean, money's no object when you're dealing with that kind of technology. They'll do anything to hide it, because the same oil corporations that were wielded power and put Hitler into power, the same oil corporations and chemical corporations are the same corporations that dominate our society. They're the same companies. That's a known fact. I mean, my father quit Mobil Oil Corporation when he was being made the vice president of the corporation in 1946, when Mobil took over Magnolia Oil. And I asked my father in the 50s, and later on, I asked him why he quit when he was being made vice president of Mobil Oil Corporation. And he just told me this whole stuff about trading with the enemy. You know, that whole thing, that later they've written books about it. He knew it all. He was somehow made privy to this information, and it just blew his mind, because he had gone up like a sucker and signed up for the war to fight the Japanese and the Germans, you know. And here his corporation was providing fuel for U-boats, and they were dealing with chemicals and the whole bit, you know. So it totally disillusioned him. I mean, he didn't want to have any part with this corporation, because he realized what a sucker they'd made of it. They laughed at him when he came in as a Navy uniform. They laughed at him. They were laughing at him. Why do that? You don't have to do that, Raymond. You could just stay here in the corporation and, you know, get fat with the rest of us, you know. And, I mean, they knew all along it was just a big war for profit. And that's how Hitler was put into power. Basically, he was chosen by the Rockefellers in the 20s to be the leader over all the other guys that were competitors for, you know, the leader of the Third Reich. And it was envisioned in 1923 that after the war that all the people who survived would come, that the New World Order would come into existence in 1945 when the war came to an end, and that's what the United Nations was. The United Nations is nothing more than a cover for the original Third Reich idea, a world, you know, a world supergovernment, basically. And but
Could you briefly mention the Illuminati?
well, yeah, well, like George Bush's father was the founder of the United Nations, and he was also the guy who swung the loan for Hitler. I mean, when I discovered the Morgenthau's pastoral policy as a real, factual, historical document in 1960, I think it was 68, I went to a gala sponsored by Governor Connolly in Texas, and at a cocktail party before the gala, I met a PhD candidate in history whose specialty was the Treaty of Versailles, and I said I have heard about a document that I would like to know about because it relates to the Treaty of Versailles, and it's called Morgenthau's Pastoral Policy. And I'd heard that there was this, it was a fantastic story. And he says, what was it? And I said that under the Treaty of Versailles, there was something called Morgenthau's Pastoral Policy, which was to exterminate the Germans, reduce Germany to a pasture land. And he said, you got a moment? And I said, yes. He says, come with me. We went to the main building at the University of Texas where LBJ's documents were stored until his research center was finished. He went into a vault. He opened it. It was a combination vault, big, huge vault. He had permission to go in the vault. He went in the vault. He came back out, and he says, are your hands clean? And I said, yes. He said, better wipe them off, make sure they're clean, hold them out. And he put the document in my hand, and I examined it. And it was just as, it was the original document. It came from Woodrow Wilson down through a chain of people to LBJ. And it was stamped in a red, it had a red stamp by the Versailles Committee with a number on it. And it was drafted by Hans Morgenthau, the Secretary of Treasury under Wilson. I'm not sure what Morgenthau's capacity was. He might have been an advisor of some sort. But he drafted the document, and it was called Morgenthau's Pastoral Policy because the idea was to reduce Germany to a pastoral land. They were going to kill all the Germans and raise all the buildings and turn Germany into a pasture because the Germans were inherently warlike race. That's what it said in the document. And so this was drafted by Hans Morgenthau Sr., who was an anti-Zionist, by the way, an anti-Zionist. He was a Reformed Jew, which meant that he considered himself thoroughly modern Hans, you know. And his son later became a Zionist. Hans Morgenthau Jr. became a Zionist, and he drafted a phony document for World War II, at the end of World War II, called Morgenthau's Pastoral Policy. It was a phony document that intended to cover up the original one, which was never made public and was always lied and concealed. And the Morgenthau's Pastoral Policy of World War II was nothing more than to denazify Germany. That's all that was. It didn't involve exterminating anybody or anything like that. So that was a Zionist drafted that one, whereas his father was terrified of the Ashkenazim from Moscow.
Well, Mr. Lyne, I think we're running out of time, but this has certainly been fascinating, and I really appreciate the time that you've spent with us. But thank you, sir. I really
Okay.
appreciate your time.
Okay,
Thank
thank
you
you.
very much.
Enjoyed being here.